right, welcome everyone. So, a bit of an unexpected surprise that we're talking about elections tonight and an election is being called in this country. But we're really glad that you could join us, and there really is no better time to talk about elections then, given the state of what's going on. And so effectively our event tonight is entitled Climate Crossroads, the future of climate policy in the year of pivotal elections, where we're going to be examining not just the UK's elections, but the US, India, the EU, and a variety of other elections around the world in this pivotal year for understanding what's going forward with climate change. So I'm Besier-McGrath. I'm an assistant professor in international social and public policy within the Department of Public Policy. And I want to thank the LSE Research and Impact Support Fund for their generous funding for hosting tonight's event. And I will host this moving forward. So effectively, as noted before, this is a pretty extraordinary year where almost 3 billion people will be voting, with countries that represent more than a third of global emissions. Right? So if we're thinking about the long-run horizons of climate change, climate policy, this is in many ways a very pivotal year, given the importance of these elections, and in many contexts, the extent to which elections are not exactly clear-cut. Now, the increasing politicization of climate change and climate policy has been going on for a long time, but it's becoming more and more concrete when it comes to issues around net zero and specific policies and targets, particularly within the last year or so. And so the Conservative Party within the UK, in particular, since Rishi Sunak's election to the leadership, has been moving more and more in terms of the rollback of clear, strong net zero policies to achieve targets. And this RISF funded support money that we've been able to get with the LSE here has been allowing us to do research that shows that some of the electoral gambles here may not actually be paying dividends for the Conservatives in terms of boosting their support. Now, somewhat fortuitously, we also have some research in the field right now. This is a survey that's currently being fielded. We've got about 1,000 respondents so far. And echoing those themes before, the Conservative Party's rollback in terms of net zero policies has only moderately increased support amongst their voters in this panel over on the left-hand side. However, Labour Party's rollback of many of its green pledges in February of this year has actually seen quite a bit of shrinking of support in terms of its actual policy agenda. Right? So this suggests that there are these kind of asymmetric effects going on within the electorate with regards to net zero policy support moving forward. This is paralleled by recent events within the US, where as part of the upcoming US presidential election, the politicization of policy, and in particular in reference to climate change and facilitating the green transition, has occurred with the Biden administration announcing increasing tariffs on solar and also on electric vehicles. India, the largest democracy in the world, which is having its elections right now, is also exemplary of a country that has severe vulnerability towards climate change. Yet, in order to pursue economic development and in order to pursue well-being for many of its citizens, has increasingly ramped up fossil fuel production in parallel with renewable energy production. And so again, this is an election which is pivotal for many people's well-being and vulnerability moving forward, given the direction of the government in terms of the policies being adopted. And finally, while we may often think about elections having impacts on climate change and climate change policy, climate change is increasingly going to change the way that we actually field elections and are able to ensure legitimacy and effective electoral processes. And so the extent to which the increasing nature of climate change and the increasing events and disasters that we're experiencing over time affects our ability to represent the wishes of people and elect representatives is going to be increasingly important. So tonight we're going to be grappling with all of these questions and potentially many more. We will have our 4 speakers who will each speak on aspects of these different themes, and we will also have a Q&A session that will allow those of you in the room to ask questions and also those of you who are joining online to further extend the conversation. And so before we get into the specific talks, I first want to introduce our speakers. and I will introduce them in the order of them speaking. So first we have Professor Sarah Birch, who is Professor of Political Science at the Department of Political Economy, King's College London, and as well as Director of Research. So Sarah's research is mainly focused on the empirical study of political ethics, including electoral integrity, ethical reasoning in politics and corruption perceptions, as well as research on popular perceptions of and reactions to environmental problems. Sarah has previously held chairs at the University of Essex and the University of Glasgow, and is a Fellow of the British Academy and the Royal Society of Edinburgh, as well as an Associate Fellow of the Institute of Public Policy Research. And she is also a project lead on the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance report on the impact of natural disasters upon elections. Professor Stephen Fisher is a Professor of Political Science, Professor of Political Sociology at the University of Oxford, whose research has primarily been on public opinion and how people vote in elections, both in Britain and also cross-nationally. The main themes of his research have been related to attitudes of climate change, ethnic minority political attitudes and behavior, the analysis of election outcomes, political geography, election forecasting, tactical voting, and quantitative research methods. As well as writing academic research articles, Stephen has worked with the United Nations Development Programme on a global survey of climate change attitudes, entitled The People's Climate Vote, and provided election predictions for the BBC, including exit polls for general elections. Stephen blogs also on election forecasts and election analysis at electionsetc.com. Dr. Pavithra Suryanarayan is an assistant, but yet soon to be associate professor within the Department of Government here at the LSE. Dr. Suryanarayan studies how the politics of social status shapes state capacity, redistributive preferences, and vote choice in ranked societies like India and the United States. So her research pursues these research questions using methods in historical political economy, emphasizing causal identification and spatial and survey analysis, as well as archival research. And beyond work on these ranked systems, Pavi's research has developed two further substantive areas of interest, being the relationship between state capacity and class voting, and party organization and party system institutionalization within the Indian states. Her work has won discipline-wide awards and been featured in the New York Times, Le Monde, The Economist, and The Hindu, amongst others, and she is also an editor and contributor to Broadsheet, an interdisciplinary academic blog on historical political economy. And finally, Dr. Michael Lerner is an assistant professor in the Department of Government here at LSE, who is focusing on comparative environmental politics with a broad interest in the challenges and strategies related to adopting timely policy responses to environmental change. His research focuses primarily on policy advocacy, including corporate lobbying on climate change, transnational advocacy networks, and the innovation and diffusion of environmental policy. Michael has published his work in the American Journal of Political Science, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and other peer-reviewed journals. So each of our speakers are now going to speak for about 10 minutes on their respective topics, after which we will engage in a short panel conversation before moving to the Q&A. If you're online, you can already type your questions into the Q&A in the chat, and I will go through them as we go along. And if you're in person, when the time comes, feel free to raise your hand, and we'll get to as many questions as possible. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Sarah Birch, who is now going to talk on this topic.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Liam. Also thank you to the LSE for enabling this event. So I'm not going to talk about climate change as a policy issue. I'm going to talk about climate change as a physical phenomenon that has interfered with electoral processes in a number of contexts, and specifically extreme weather events that are one of the impacts of climate change, one of the manifestations of climate change. I was going to start with India, but I'm actually going to start with the UK, given that a general election has just been called. So the Brexit referendum that happened in 2016 was like today a day of torrential rains and flooding in some places. And probably we remember a lot of other things about that day. We don't remember the rain so much, but there has been a study, not by myself, that showed that, in fact, this did impact on the outcome. And that the Remain vote actually benefited slightly, so we would have been even more likely to want to leave the UK, the EU, if it had been a sunny day. And so what I'm going to talk about is the various different ways in which extreme weather events can impact on the electoral process. I'll come on to the second example. The one I was going to start with is India, because there is an election currently going on in India, and I'm sure we've all read media reports of really horrific temperatures, up to like 49 degrees in some places, that are very dangerous for human life. And the Indian Electoral Commission has a very detailed plan as to what they're going to do to enable people to vote under these conditions, and possible contingency arrangements in place. This does represent a real challenge for democratic procedures when you have an unexpected event such as this that takes place while an election is actually being run, and can interfere with the rollout, the administrative rollout of the election in various ways, and also in the decisions that voters make to either go and vote or not to vote. And some decisions may be ones that people are not able to get out and vote because of an event. And the Indian example is actually one of the very few examples I know of where a heat wave has had this impact, but much more commonly it's floods. Floods are the most common type of extreme weather event that interfere with electoral processes, sometimes also wildfires, other events, but floods are the types of things that we see most often interfere and make elections difficult. And I've been working with colleagues, as Liam said, at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance in Stockholm, which is an intergovernmental organisation, and also a colleague from Martínez Brisbane University in Australia is working on this with me. And what we're doing is we're developing a database of elections that have been affected by extreme weather events, and also a series of case studies on how they've been affected, on how electoral authorities have coped with this, and then doing some analyses as well. And we've found in these case studies that extreme weather events have affected elections in quite a number of different ways. And the aim of the project is really to try to advise electoral authorities as to what they can do to make elections resilient to extreme weather events. So that's what I'm going to focus on. The main thing that election authorities really need to do to make elections resilient to extreme weather events is they need to put in place contingency plans. And I was going to say that we expect to have an election in the autumn in this country, and we've had very rainy autumns recently, and so the Electoral Commission hasn't really put in place any contingency plans, and this could lead to problems, but hopefully on the 4th of July it won't be quite so rainy as it is today. So that may not necessarily be so much of a problem for this general election in the UK, but certainly the last general election we had was one that had taken place not long after a series of floods, and if the floods had actually happened in closer proximity to the elections, it could have created serious problems, as happened in Brexit. Now, California, the US state of California, is a very good example of an area that has put in place some really good contingency plans. They have statewide guidelines, and then the counties have to, within these guidelines, adopt contingency plans that are specific to the needs of their particular county. And all the counties have done this to protect California against wildfires in case a fire takes place right before an election or during elections. Another thing that can be done is that elections can be held at times of year that are less vulnerable to extreme weather events. A lot of extreme weather events are seasonal. Now, sometimes constitutions make this really difficult because they specify that election has to be held at certain intervals and a certain time. But very often, the Prime Minister or someone else, legislators have the power to decide when elections are held. And it would make sense possibly to sort of basically have rule out holding elections at times that are particularly vulnerable to extreme weather events. Electoral authorities also will usefully coordinate with other agencies to put in place standing working arrangements and standing sort of regular meetings with other agencies, such as meteorological agencies that can provide early warning of possible events that are coming up, such as heat waves, and disaster relief organisations, both non-governmental and governmental, that can plan in advance what they would do if there were an event that took place. And India is actually an example of a country that's done this quite well. Mostly it's at the state level, so the plans vary from state to state, but there is quite a lot of joint working between disaster relief organisations, meteorological organisations, and some Indian states, those that are particularly vulnerable to things like flooding, for example, to put in place arrangements to enable people to vote under these circumstances. And in the current elections, they have a very detailed 13-page plan as to medical assistance at polling stations and what they're going to do to speed up the vote so that people don't have to queue for so long and so forth. So they're a good example of best practice in this area. Staff training, contingency funding mechanisms are also important. And you'd be surprised, you think, oh, well, what's really vulnerable is voting day, because that happens on one day in most countries, not in India. In most countries, it happens on one day. And so if an extreme weather event unexpectedly happens on that day, then that would really cause problems. But actually, our case studies have shown that it's electoral registration that's much more vulnerable to disruption. Because what happens very often is people get displaced. And then when they get displaced, there's often not in the location where they're expected to vote. And then sometimes they lose their identity documents when they're displaced in a flood or a fire or something, or they may just leave it behind when they move. And then the electoral authority often doesn't know where they are. Or if they're in some temporary accommodation, it finds it difficult to set up arrangements to enable them to vote. And so putting in place some kind of online electoral register that covers the entire country and all citizens so that those people can be tracked and they can be enabled to vote wherever they are is important for making sure that people can vote even if they are displaced through an extreme weather event that happens prior to the election. Australia is an excellent example of a country that does this really well. They have compulsory voting, so for a long time they've had lots of measures to ensure that voting is as easy as possible for people, and they have a variety of different mobile polling places and other mechanisms, postal voting, to make it possible for people to vote wherever they are under whatever circumstances. So there are things that can be done by electoral authorities to enable people to vote if the election has been disrupted by an extreme weather event. And however, not all countries are really doing this. Even a lot of countries who are quite vulnerable to extreme weather events are not doing this. And some of the research I've done have shown this does actually in some cases lead to electoral violence, outbreaks of violence that are connected with the events. That can lead, in the case of Mozambique, one of our case studies showed that it led to people being angry that they weren't able to vote because that they had the displacement had meant that they weren't no longer registered to vote in a place that they were expected to vote, and they attributed this to some partisan conspiracy to make it impossible for them to vote. And so putting in place these contingency plans is extremely important in making elections resilient to climate change. I'm very much hoping that the UK and other countries around the world will take this a bit more seriously, because we are going to be having more extreme weather events, and this is going to disrupt electoral processes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. So I'm going to talk about climate policy and the UK and the forthcoming general election, which I really didn't see coming next month. It's quite common to hear commentators talk about the energy transition away from fossil fuels to renewables and other climate change mitigation policies as expensive things that voters won't pay for, and arguments that it will be unpopular and therefore ultimately politicians won't go through with decarbonisation and climate change mitigation. I'm going to actually try to craft an analytical argument that says actually there's quite a few reasons why you'd expect the next government, which is most likely to be a Labour government, but any next government to continue with decarbonisation and plans to get to net zero 2050 in the medium term at least, because it's also in their electoral incentives to do so. So the first thing is, we've already done a lot of decarbonisation in the UK. We're down 50% on 1990 levels, at the first of the G20 countries to do that. And we have the Climate Change Act, so we have legislation kind of keeping things moving along in a legislative way. That's not always guaranteed. Look at the Child Poverty Reduction Act, look at what's happened in Scotland, but it does help keep the process of policy making for decarbonisation on track. The recent assessment is that the UK has met the third carbon budget and is set to overshoot the fourth carbon budget and meet the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. And the Climate Change Committee vision for decarbonisation going forward to 2050 is one not with hair shirts of massive energy reduction in terms of usage, but actually decarbonisation of energy and a little bit of an increase in demand. So it seems doable, though it is going to get increasingly difficult as you get closer and closer to net zero. On the public opinion side, there's consistent support for net zero 2050 as a law in the Delta Poll surveys ever since it came in 2019. It's been about 60% when it's been measured sort of roughly annually by Delta Poll. YouGov does some trackers looking at various different environmental and climate change and net zero policy issues. There's a pretty consistent, around about 70% of people say that it's right for the government to spend money on wind power and solar power. And so that's not just the regular thing where people like wind and solar, but they're actually happy for the government to be spending money on it. They also, same number, 70%, are in favour of public ownership of energy companies, and that's precisely what the Labour Party are planning on doing, and they reasserted that in their Next Steps launch earlier this month. And I'm now going to turn to a sort of argument for electoral incentives based on the long-term experience of British elections. We've had elections in which Labour and the Conservatives come first and second in all the elections since 1922. There's been 27 of them. And you can explain the outcome of 19 of them just by the maxim that if there's an economic crisis, the government tends to lose, government does lose, and then otherwise the government wins. And we seem to be heading to an election where the government are going to lose because there's been an economic crisis. There's another little rule that you can save yourself as a government by replacing the Prime Minister after the economic crisis. But this government has replaced the Prime Minister twice and still had another recession after the last Prime Minister took office. So it looks like it's going to be another case that will fit that broad pattern. It is notable how many of those crisis elections, those economic crises, have actually been to do with energy and energy costs. So if you go back to 1926, we had the general strike over, which was ultimately caused by the price of coal, and the Conservatives then lost the 1929 general election. 1973 oil crisis lost the Conservatives the 1974 February election. The 1979 to 80 Iranian revolution and oil price spike would have lost the Tories the 1983 election, but the Falklands War saved it. That's one of the rare exceptions to the rule I was giving before. There was another kind of not so near miss, but striking case in 2000 where we had a fuel price crisis. And the Tories were ahead in the polls for the first time since 1993 for 7 years because of that fuel price crisis and the sort of blockade of the petrol stations. It was successfully resolved by the Blair government, and Blair went on to win in 2001, but it was looking pretty bad for a while. The 2008-2009 financial crisis and Great Recession, a lot of people forget that was exacerbated by an oil price spike, and so energy prices were part of the mix of that economic crisis that led to Labour losing in 2010. And now we've had the cost of living crisis since 2021 till this year, and ongoing. I'm now going to explain that when it comes to the time to write up why the Tories lost the 2024 election, I think one so far neglected part of the narrative is actual cost of living crisis that was directly related to energy and fuel prices. So we're used to hearing about Partygate, Pinches maybe, and Patterson. But the Conservative Party popularity started declining in mid-2021 at the time that the cost of living crisis and inflation started increasing, including gas prices in 2021. It wasn't just post-Ukraine war that gas prices went up. They were going up already before then. And they dropped by 7 points between June 21 at their peak to 36% just before the Partygate revelations came out in November 2021. And they only dropped a further 4 points after that, immediately after the Partygate revelations. Now, things got worse for the government after the Ukraine invasion and worse for the energy prices. A key problem for the Truss government was spooking the markets, yes, and the mini-budget, yes, but the mini-budget came on top of an energy price guarantee that was looking like it would cost about 2.5% of GDP in terms of extra borrowing. And it was in that context, with such a huge commitment, I think it was worth about £1,000 per household in September 2022 prices. It was that huge borrowing to deal with the energy prices that was a crucial part of the problems that the Truss government faced, and why Liz Truss got booted out by her party so quickly. And it's actually also fed through to the 2023 recession, which has made life difficult for Rishi Sunak and the current Conservative administration. Now, as Liam was saying, if you look at the polls, the net zero rollback that Rishi Sunak did in late 2023 didn't help him recover. And also, as Liam was saying, the dropping of the 28 billion target for green spending for Labour didn't actually benefit them in the polls. It might have even weakened them a bit for their own supporters in terms of favourability. We'll see how that plays out during the campaign. But at the minute, the Labour policy is not so much to emphasise climate change mitigation, but to do climate change mitigation through emphasising the need for cheaper energy, and that renewables are cheaper, and energy security, and so we don't want to be dependent on fossil fuels from foreign sources and dictators like Putin. So the pitch from Labour is all about cheapness, costs, and security. And actually, that's pretty much the pitch from the Conservatives, though they've phrased things a bit differently, much more in terms of not imposing unreasonable costs on citizens, and being more moderate than whoever they think they're being more moderate than, presumably Labour. But we could argue later about just how different their policies are. But the crucial argument I'm trying to make, that I don't think many others are trying to make, is if the next government, presumably Labour, want to win re-election, they have, given what I told you about the historical long run, a huge incentive to avoid another recession and avoid another economic crisis. And actually investing in renewables and getting green growth is actually an important part of avoiding another recession. And the energy security as well should help avoid another recession. So there are incentives for the politicians, for the next government, to actually continue with climate change mitigation, because it coincides helpfully with cheaper energy and more secure energy supplies. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I have to start by saying I'm not a climate change expert. But what I can talk about is the Indian elections and what is at stake in 2024. So I've just come back from 6 weeks of field work in India on a project on taxation and how taxes feature in people's minds as they think about their political preferences. So I had a chance to talk to people across 6 states over 6 weeks. And the elections are still ongoing. They started in early April. They'll conclude at the end of May. They happen over 7 phases. And they do so to take 1 billion people safely to the polls in extreme heat. So the first thing to note here, before I actually get into politics and the politics of what these politics will have to say about climate issues, is that It's been a very hot summer. And poll after poll, we've finished 5 phases. There's still 2 more phases of the elections to go. Turnout has been lower. And one obvious thing to explore in the near future is how much temperature differentials mattered to how people showed up on election day in India in 2024. So what's at stake this election? So it's the first thing I want to note is, if you've heard of anything, you must have heard of Prime Minister Modi in the last 5 years as a strong man in Indian politics. But I just want to flag that even in 2019, which was a resounding year for the ruling party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, the party only won about 36% of the vote, or 37% of the vote, which means a majority of India votes for alternatives to the BJP. So the first thing to note is politics in India is deeply federalized. People make their electoral decisions state by state. They really care about their state issues and they really care about their local issues when they go to the polls. The second thing to note is the last decade have meant not just a strong type of development, which has focused on infrastructure, it has seen widening inequalities. So one of the big things that's emerged in the elections is who's the development for? Is it for the wealthy that get wealthier, or is it a more inclusive model of development we need to think about? The third is who has gotten richer? India's inequalities don't just cleave by class, they cleave by states. So you see a widening inequality between some of the southern states, which are wealthier, which pick parties alternative to the BJP, and the Hindi heartland, which hasn't done that well developmentally in the past decade. The third type of inequality are group-based inequalities. India is a country deeply divided by religion and caste, and the kind of growth we have seen has helped certain parts of the caste system get wealthier while others have lagged behind. So if we think about these 3 things, inequality by space, which is the states, inequality by class, which is the wealthy versus poor, and then inequalities by groups, be it caste or religion, what does it mean for thinking about climate change politics and its stakes for the elections? So the first, by state. What has happened over the last decade is a form of fiscal centralization, which India hasn't seen since the 1920s. And I say the 1920s because that's when the current form of fiscal federalism in India took shape under the British rule. It gave a lot of strength to states to raise their own taxes and the center to have its own domain. And what has happened in the last decade is a move towards fiscal centralization, which has strengthened the center's hands vis-a-vis the states. Now, why should this matter for climate change? Fiscal centralization then greatly tips the center to decide who gets what when disasters strike. So case in point was Tamil Nadu, which is a state in the south that I come from last year, which had one of the worst floods it had experienced in a while. And the state is still fighting with the center to release funds for the disaster that took place last year. And its belief is that it's not getting money because its politics don't align with the center, right? So one way to think about climate politics in India is who's deciding what money goes to both disaster preparedness and disaster management once climate disasters strike. The second way to think about the stakes of politics is who is benefiting or not from investment into climate technologies. So a big story of the current BJP government has been a move to clean coal and environmentally safe forms of energy production, things like solar panels. But what has happened are huge capital investments that benefit a handful of companies and very little employment creation. So what does climate change mean under policy if another term of BJP comes in that decides to further invest in big businesses versus more inclusive growth models? The third type of inequalities that emerge with the current party are its fairly divisive politics between India's Hindus and Muslims, but also divisive politics along caste. And here we really should think about the intersection of climate change and group-based inequalities because India's occupational choices still tend to cleave along caste and religious lines. So So again, going back to an example from the state I come from, Tamil Nadu suffers from floods pretty regularly because of its large exposure to the coast. But that coast is entirely populated almost by fishing tribes and fishing castes, which are largely lower castes. So if you think about the impact of disaster, they tend to hit communities which are already extremely marginalized and discriminated within India's caste system. So thinking about the political choices at play here, we need to think about if we get an India coalition, which is the opposition, versus the NDA, which is the BJP coalition, who are these two parties going to benefit in terms of their policy priorities, and who are they going to react to if disasters strike? Which parts of the country will they protect, and which part of the country will they leave exposed? And are there things to be thought about in terms of policies that emerge along these three dimensions of inequality, which is spatial, class, and caste? Now, the final thing I want to say is, Indians experience climate change on a very visceral level. You go to New Delhi in the months of October to February, and the air is unbreathable, right? And this is where the country's wealthiest and most politically powerful live. There's no way to opt out of the air you breathe, right? Whether you're rich or poor, high caste or low caste, politically powerful or weak, you have to breathe the same air. And yet, change in terms of introducing climate policy to make air breathable has been enormously hard in a state like Delhi. And why is that? And again, here it cleaves on those three lines. The center and the state can't agree. The wealthy and the poor can't agree about who bears the responsibility for fixing breathing air. And things are increasingly polarized by partisan lines. People do not want to hear that their own party is to blame for the kind of air that is, what they're breathing in real time. And so, I think we're going to see increasingly climate change itself emerge as a clear partisan and political issue in successive elections as India experiences further worsening of heat waves, further worsening of flooding, and more unbearable air to breathe. And as far as election prognosis goes, I guess, the party that's in power is widely tipped to come back, but the elections are much more competitive than we expected. And they seem to reflect a lot of these inequalities I've just highlighted, which is, inequalities across the states, inequalities by class, and inequalities across groups, and who is benefiting from the goods of development that we've seen in the last 10 years. So that's all I have to say.
All right, well, speaking of polarization, I'm going to chat for a few minutes about the United States and the elections coming up in November. So this November, when Americans go to the polls, they're going to have a choice to make when it comes to climate, whether to stay the course, keep moving ahead, or make a pretty radical U-turn. Now you might ask, but wait, what about greater ambition? Maybe we could have more climate policy. And unfortunately, that is probably not going to happen this election, and I'll tell you why. The first thing to know is when it comes to policymaking in the United States, the president is not necessarily a very powerful actor. Okay? So if the president's party does not control either the House or the Senate, that is to say it's a divided government, the president's power very much is to say no through the presidential veto, and to take the existing laws that are on the books and implement them strategically to advance their goals. It's only if the president's party controls both the House and the Senate that then the president is the negotiator in chief and is really sort of trying to corral their party to make big changes happen when it comes to taxes, when it comes to spending, when it comes to really strong new restrictions. At the current moment, the Democrats control the Senate and the Republicans control the House. And Democrats need about 5 seats to take control of the House, okay? This is probably within their grasp because a number of Republicans, about 18 of them, are trying to defend a district that Joe Biden won last time around, whereas only about 5 Democrats are in that position. So we can bet that the Democrats have a good chance of taking control of the House. But the Democrats only control the Senate today by about 1 vote, by exactly 1 vote. And Joe Manchin is retiring, and Joe Manchin is a Democrat from West Virginia, a coal-based state, a very heavily Republican state at the moment. We can bet that his replacement will have a tough time getting elected as a Democrat. In addition to that, there are 10 other Democrats who are in red states who are trying to win, and there are 0 Republicans who are incumbents from the Senate that are in blue states. So basically what we're very likely to see is that Democrats will come to control the House, Republicans will come to control the Senate, and we'll be in a situation of legislative stalemate, just reversed, which is, by the way, the first time that will have happened in American history, that you'll have just a swapping of roles. So let's talk for a minute about what Joe Biden and Donald Trump would do if elected in the world of a divided Congress, okay? So we're keeping ambition kind of off the table. The question is straight ahead or a U-turn. So for Joe Biden, he's mostly running this election on his past achievements when it comes to climate change. He's not making a lot of big promises. So over the past 3 years, while there hasn't been exactly a climate revolution in the US government, there's continued support for fossil fuel development in the Joe Biden administration. They have made some pretty important changes to accelerate US climate action. This includes pretty meaningful emissions reduction standards and, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act, which looks like it will weigh in at a surprisingly large $1.2 trillion. That's basically, there are uncapped subsidies for renewable energy that turns out people want to take advantage of. So they thought it was going to be 350 billion. Looks like it'll be 1.2 trillion. The campaign, if you go to Joe Biden's website for his campaign, there's no platform, okay? He's been pretty vague about exactly what his plans are when it comes to climate. This is probably a combination of election strategy, and frankly, it's kind of hard to top the Inflation Reduction Act in terms of something big. And maybe pragmatically, you don't want to make promises that you can't keep, especially if you're not going to control both the House and the Senate. We can certainly expect the US to continue to participate in international climate negotiations, provide climate finance, and do something of a reasonable, good faith effort at the international level to meet US commitments under Paris. Now, one policy that climate advocates dream of, if Joe Biden were to be reelected, is that Joe Biden could declare that climate change is a national emergency. And with that power, say, you know what? I'm going to stop the import of all new oil and gas. I'm going to stop drilling on public lands. I'm going to stop US fossil fuel companies from investing in fossil fuel development abroad. That's what would be within the ambit of the president if he decided to declare climate change as a national emergency. This is not going to happen. Except if there is some big climate emergency, something really powerful, moving that people get worked up about, and they say, what are you going to do? He might have that in his back pocket as an option. So it's not exactly dead on arrival as an idea in a Joe Biden White House, this idea of a climate national emergency. But I think it would take some very special circumstances to see that happen. So when it comes to Donald Trump, there's a lot more to say. So he's been much more explicit. So Myron Ebel, who's a high-profile climate change denier, he was the head of Donald Trump's EPA transition team in 2016. He said, quote, Trump will undo everything Biden has done. He will move more quickly and go further than he did before. Okay? So further than he did before. And it's worth saying how much of a disappointment Donald Trump's first administration was to climate skeptics, okay? There was some serious underperformance that happened in 2016, and this was because there was bureaucratic resistance. There were scandals that were unforced errors, including the head of the EPA, who had to resign due to some really dumb corruption, and some sloppy rulemaking that led them to have some defeats in the courts. This time, Trump has said that his number one regret is that he was too nice his first time around, and specifically by that he means staffing. No more of these centrist Republicans is he going to name. He's saying, I want my guys in power. So he's going to staff his administration with allies. His judicial appointments, he had very meaningful influence over the composition of the courts during his time as president. They're now much more friendly to anti-climate arguments. And frankly, his supporters were shocked that he won in 2016. This time they have had much more time to prepare. There's a set of Trump-affiliated policy think tanks who have put out very helpful PDFs that say very specifically what his appointees, the people who wrote these PDFs, would like to do. So here's what's on the menu, okay? So probably we won't see the Inflation Reduction Act be repealed. It will be weakened. There will be stringent rules in place for green companies to get access to the money. Maybe they'll make the money available to questionably green companies. You could imagine sort of on the margins working to make that a little bit less effective. There's some recent emission rules for vehicles. Those are going to be gone. Almost certainly going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, send it to the Senate, where it would officially fail to be ratified, and try to sort of put a nail in the coffin on that. Accelerate approvals for some new fossil fuel development that Joe Biden has kind of been sitting on, trying to say, okay, I'll say no if I win, but I don't want to say no before, because then I get punished in the election. Donald Trump would say yes to these kinds of things. California has been a real thorn in Trump's side when he was president the first time, because California has a waiver. They're allowed to have more stringent air pollution rules than any other state in the country. They're allowed to go above and beyond the federal government, which is normally not allowed. Well, you can revoke that. And he would go to courts and try to say California can't do that anymore. And more generally, try to undercut the EPA, get rid of all this environmental justice language. He has explicitly asked for $1 billion from CEOs of oil and gas companies in exchange for weakening oil and gas rules. So he had a meeting about that, and he sort of said that. So this is a pretty major reversal of US climate policy commitments. So the last thing I want to leave you with is to take a step back, okay? So no matter who wins the presidency, the United States will see its emissions of greenhouse gases fall over the next 6 years, 4 years plus, then everything is modeled out to 2030. But it is important to say that this election does have meaningful implications for the pace at which these reductions happen. So there's a think tank, Energy Innovation. They've done some nice modeling that says if Donald Trump wins, which means the IRA is cut back, which means EPA rules that are about emissions get repealed, and assuming that because Congress is split, there's not a lot of new spending on fossil fuels, the US emissions in 2030 would be about 25% lower than their values from 2005. So 25% drop, which is, frankly, a big deal. And that's because of global trends in markets around the price of renewable energy and things like that. However, if Biden is president, they expect emissions in 2030 to be 50% lower than 2005. So twice as rapid a pace of emissions reductions. Given that the global task of keeping the world warming to 1.5 degrees C requires a fall of 50% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, that is a huge task. The US is pretty critical to making that happen. And so this November, as in actually very many of these other elections around the world, the hopes and dreams of a 1.5 degree world are on the ballot. So thanks very much.
So I want to thank our speakers for really setting the scene of all the kind of dynamics that are going on worldwide in different countries, both in terms of the politics, but also these climatic events moving forward. So we're going to slowly transition to the Q&A, but before we do so, I'll take my kind of privilege as chair to kind of set the first question up in motion. And I think it's really to do with like the thing that brought me to this topic in the first place, which is like a lot of what we're thinking about and talking about is crises, disasters, like things that meaningfully change people's lives, how they impact politics, but also how politics shapes the way people experience them and the way that they're impacted, right? So Sarah talked obviously about kind of how this relates to elections, but even your previous work in terms of position taking in response to floods in the UK and how that affected electoral accountability. Stephen, you talked about crises when it comes to energy, access, the costs of living, and how kind of perceived failures in terms of responding to them affects vote choice. Pavi has mentioned these climatic events, right, while they might kind of be non-political, the extent to which there is government intervention and responses, the extent to which people are accounted for is very political. And then, Michael, you obviously brought up the prospect of continued climatic events within the US and how they kind of play out in a world where there maybe has been a kind of policy drawback. So I think to kind of start off, I think it'd be interesting to get our thoughts of issues around electoral accountability in these democracies when, if there is these kind of major shocks, these major climatic issues in a context where there maybe is policy in action, or even if there is policy action, as we're seeing, say, in the US, do voters actually reward governments for this, right? There's a lot of discussion about whether voters are actually rewarding Trump for the Inflation Reduction, rewarding Biden for the Inflation Reduction Act, or interpreting it differently. So whoever wants to kick it off, go ahead, Sarah.
The assumption in a lot of the discussion of a place like the UK is that people are voting on the basis of parties' policies. We have programmatic party competition. And in the work I've done on the UK, which you generously mentioned, that's what I found, that voters are reacting to party policies. Although, Pavi mentioned that, that the politics of disaster relief in India, and most countries in the world do not have programmatic party competition. Most countries in the world have more patronage-based competition or clientelistic competition. And disaster relief is a major factor in a lot of that, because when there's a natural disaster, there's a whole bunch of money comes in, either from the state or from outside sources, from international aid, and then that money has to be distributed really quickly because it's a disaster, right? And so whoever's distributing that money, whoever has a role in it, has a lot of discretion. And there's a huge, and I just did a study on this in Honduras, there's clientelization of disaster relief is really, really common. And in some cases, it's actually baked into the politics of some countries. It's a disaster industry because the political actors, the politicians know there's going to be disasters. They know there's going to be this money coming their way that they'll be able to have a role in distributing. And so they promise it. There's a disaster and the voters say, oh, we're going to get something. The politicians are going to give us something if we vote for them. And so they use that, they manipulate the disasters that take place on a regular basis in advance of election to reward their voters. And so the whole disaster relief has been sort of corrupted and to play a role in mobilizing support. So that is a really common dynamic in many countries, and probably many more countries than the dynamic of voters being responsive to policy. So I'm not saying that in the UK and other countries like the UK that doesn't happen. What I'm saying is that's actually only the case, and I would say probably a minority of countries. The dynamics of who gets the money if there's a disaster is probably a much larger factor in many countries across the world.
So I want to say a couple of things. The first is, I work on parties and party organization in the Indian states. And I think the question of accountability is deeply intertwined with who do you hold accountable? Right? So again, in a country like India, where politics is federal, do you hold the center or the state accountable? But more complicatedly, a large number of people don't even run for the same party across successive elections. Candidates switch parties all the time. So this time, for instance, the BJP has been really successful stealing candidates from Congress or any of the state parties that it's competing in because it's emerging as the only game in town. So who do you hold accountable for a job well done or a job poorly done when the same candidate doesn't even run for the same party, right? So accountability is deeply intertwined with having strong party organizations and for parties to actually represent systematic interests that people can then say, well, you said this, but you didn't do this, right? The second is, in some sense, politics in India is starting to resemble a lot politics in the US, where partisanship is filtering what you even believe about certain issues. So there was a Bloomberg survey today that showed more than 50% of Americans think that, the US is in a recession right now, when it clearly isn't. And that unemployment is at historically high levels when it actually is at historically low levels. And the neatest explanation for this is that your partisanship is making you believe things about the economy. And so the causal arrow isn't the economy to who will you vote, it's who do you like to vote for, who is your team, then telling you whether to read the world is good or bad. And to some extent, that's emerging in India too, because of the current polarization. And if you think about climate politics, a lot of that is playing out in the same way about who do you hold accountable for and who do you believe really filters down through your partisan lens. Yeah.
As a follow-up to this, so I have like a paper on Delhi and beliefs about air pollution, and it's exactly the same partisan kind of affiliation going on in terms of whether you're supporting the incumbent or not, shapes to what extent you think vehicles versus burning are really causing the problem in that city. So.
Yeah, I think building on sort of the points here, I think that there are two elements of what turnout, of what accountability could mean here. It could mean people punish, or it could mean I just choose to stay home, right? And that's actually a very different mechanism. So in the United States, is Biden being held accountable for his Inflation Reduction Act and other environmental policies? Well, the counterfactual is not that Republicans wake up one day and decide to go vote for Joe Biden. That happens presumably to some people. But really, it's that people decide, well, you know what, there are things I don't love about X and Y and Z about him, but he did this thing and that'll motivate me to get to the polls. So turnout is very much the way in which being rewarded or punished under Donald Trump, his actions on climate change really were part of the larger soup of discontent that got Democrats to really show up in a way that they historically might not have, right? So that is a form of accountability in turnout that actually I think really does matter. And here we're talking also about visibility, right? So with disaster relief, it's the fact that I can see it and I can say, I know who gave that to me. There's a nice statistic from the United States, Healy and Malhotra. They estimated that every dollar a politician spends on disaster relief equals a certain number of votes. To get that number of votes, you'd have to spend $15 of disaster prevention, right? So if you want to build a seawall, you'll have to build 15 times as much as giving people food after a disaster. So this is very, it resonates also, I think. And so in the climate sense, why are we talking about EVs, about electric vehicles so much? Why are we talking about home boilers so much? Well, part of it is that they contribute to climate action, and they are important, but they're not the whole game. Electricity transmission is a much more powerful tool per pound, as it were, but I have a car or I don't have a car. I have a heat pump or I don't have a heat pump. Nobody personally owns electricity transmission. And that is a big difference. So when it comes to climate policy, which climate policies does a pro-climate politician choose? They often choose ones that they'll get rewarded for. So visibility in that sense is really important.
So I was arguing that there is a long-run track record of the British people holding their governments to account for economic crises, and I didn't say that. By that I mean either recessions or devaluations from fixed exchange rates that are kind of shocking, like the ERM crisis or the devaluation in the 60s. So I wasn't making an argument that we've seen any evidence in Britain so far of people holding their government to account for climate events or the climate crisis. There is clearly one issue with the climate crisis, as we broadly talk about it, is that it is just an ongoing crisis that looks like it will be a crisis for quite a long time. And then there are the extreme weather events, which are increasing number of crises. And on one level, there's a danger that governments won't be held to account for these extreme weather events for two main reasons, I think. One is that they're becoming so rapid, it's hard to hold governments to account for them. The other is, ultimately, these extreme weather events are happening because of the global climate and the global climate problem, and they're not actually the fault of any particular government. So it wouldn't necessarily be rational to hold any particular government to account for them. That doesn't necessarily mean that any particular government won't be held accountable for a natural disaster, and particularly going back to what other speakers have been saying, if you badly manage that natural disaster and the relief effort is poor and the government looks bad, then the government might be held accountable for that. But so far in Britain, I don't think we've seen such a case.
Great. So I would say now we can move to the audience Q&A. So if anyone wants to ask a question, please raise your hand, and then we will have someone with the microphone come over. So over there.
Thank you for the very interesting panel and the discussion and your each one of your contributions. I'm a master's student at LSE. I'm studying political economy. I have so many questions. I don't know with which one to start, but I will pick one. So just a preface to it, I find it quite interesting that neither of you took the issue of policy and climate change on the scale that I personally believe we're talking about, which is the international scale. When we're talking about the impact of Trump versus Biden and the policy differences that might bring up to 2030, we're not just talking about the differences in emissions cut in the US, but also how the policy decisions by either will affect international climate and how that will, divert the global issue at hand. I also think it's interesting, the UK is bringing down its emissions, so are most of the developed countries, but we use the products that are produced in countries in which emissions are highly rising at the moment, and that's basically mostly because of our demand for these products. So my question is, again, sort of taking the international context, the public money will not be enough. I like your point. Pavithra, I hope I pronounce your name right, on the sort of public money within India that is coming from center to other regions, but that money cannot cover the issue, so we need to incentivize the private money to come in to offset the gap. And then my question is, how do we incentivize national governments to change national policies to incentivize private money to move towards climate-related issues? And also on an international scale, how do you see the link between national elections and their commitments on the international scale? And anything you want to comment on that and voting, whichever side you want to take, I'd be interested to hear about.
Are you collecting questions, or
Let's answer them as they come. So any thoughts? I can also pontificate while you speak.
I mean, I think in the Indian case, again, the current government has tried to be a sort of leader in the developing country world on climate issues, right? At least the talk coming from the External Affairs Ministry or the Prime Minister's office is that we are taking climate challenges very seriously. And in fact, the big ways in which they have tried to do this is by incentivizing the private sector. So the private sector has been a big player in trying to move away from traditional fossil fuels into alternative energy. But I think one of the points I want to highlight is the inherent dangers of going for big private money without thinking about the employment consequences of migrating, right? So one of the big challenges in India is it's a very young country, and it has lots and lots of people who are under the age of 40, and they need jobs. So if you think about, the issue of moving to sustainable energy sources, we need to think about moving people away from traditional fossil fuel employment into these new forms of energy. So we have to combine private sector capital investments, which are much needed in a country with scarce public funds, with imaginative employment generation. And I think that's the challenge we have to meet in the next decade, to be able to do the more immediate problem of finding people sustainable jobs and also mitigating climate change, which I don't think the current government has done very successfully. And Michael might know more about some of these issues.
Well, I mean, I think that on those issues, I wouldn't say anything different from what you're saying there. I think to your question, so your question sort of had two bits, right? So one is what's going on internationally, and the other part is what about private sector? And as Pavi's pointing out, who gets those jobs? Where does the private sector grow? It's a super important question. Internationally, the first time around when Donald Trump came in, pulled the US out of Paris, you might remember there was quite a lot of outrage and frustration and a sense of the US is really not cooperating in the way that we need cooperation. And so there was a desire to say, you know what, no, we're going to continue to eat our vegetables even if the US is going to get off its diet. That could get old. That could be hard to do a second time around, right? It gets a little bit more tempting when it's not shocking the first time. So that's a very open question. If the US decides to pull back on a lot of these things, you're right that there are supply chains that mean that there are reverberations from these decisions that definitely multiply. The US is 4% of the world population. It's something like 13% or something like that of global emissions, but that's not including the supply chains. And if you include the supply chains, it gets up to 30 or 40%. So definitely. I would say on the private sector, the government very much has been pointing the way, right? So it's not that the government is creating a whole new solar farm, 100% funded by the government, by public funds. It's tipping the balance between the price of doing one project versus a different one. Am I going to put my money into a fossil fuel plant or a renewable plant? How much money would that cost to really make it worth my time as a company to invest in renewables? And that's the carrot, right? That's the carrot versus the stick. So the Inflation Reduction Act, all carrots. That will make a difference. That will not get us all the way that we need to go. We probably need sticks as well. And their private sector doesn't really do that. So to the extent that we can make green growth profitable, that's wonderful, that's great. Government is very much in the job of deciding what is profitable. And that is the power of climate policy here. And that's why focusing on what governments can do is so important. Because while private companies follow the money, governments decide where the money would pool.
Yeah, I want to, somewhat like you did, acknowledge the first bit that you said that when I was talking about emissions reductions for the UK, I was talking about production emissions and the fact that we have much higher consumption emissions, and some of the reduction of the production emissions has been due to deindustrialisation in Britain and effectively offshoring production and transferring the accounting of emissions to China and other countries is important. How that has knock-on effects for geopolitics, I think is, it's not my main research area. It's certainly an important question to be asking. The issues of carbon border taxes are becoming increasingly important. The Indian government speaking out about them, and the European Union, and Britain's likely to come in with the European Union on carbon border taxes if they move that in that direction. is going to be seriously important for geopolitics. It'd be very interesting to see how the next US administration reacts to carbon border taxes. Even if you don't care about climate change, you'll care about those border taxes and you'll care about international trade and so on. And so it could end up that sometimes it's just the economic incentives that are going to end up driving policies, hopefully towards carbon reduction, even if it wasn't the main motivation.
And I'll just add something on the international level, because this is something I'm very familiar with. So I would say maybe it's somewhat intentional. This hasn't been discussed too much, because contrary to popular wisdom, this idea that the US kind of falling back on ambition would have negative effects across the world, just there's not really much evidence for this, both at a micro and a macro level, right? So it's very influenced by kind of classic IR theories of like collective action problems, and if one country doesn't do anything, we're all going to defect. Really, most of the evidence finds that bread and butter kind of distributive politics is what drives climate change policy, right? Both in terms of how individuals think about this, but also how policy and political platforms and kind of patronage works in this area. And so in some ways, maybe things change this time, but whether the US kind of rolls back ambition or not isn't going to change those fundamental political incentives within a lot of countries for moving forwards or for moving backwards. So we have our next two questions, I believe, over there.
Hi, thanks so much all panelists. I've really enjoyed the discussion. I'm Christine. I used to do political economy at LSE, but now I'm working for a climate think tank. So what I spend a lot of my time thinking is that we're not currently on a pathway to reaching 1.5 or even 2 degrees, right? And actually, I think Hillary Clinton tweeted a graph, a carbon brief graph, where she showed, you know, a Trump presidency, a Biden presidency, both of them do not reach 1.5 or 2. So we're not currently on the right track. So given that kind of challenging environment, and given that climate change is a global public goods challenge, it looks like things are going to get worse and worse, right? So taking it back to the accountability piece, then how did citizens expect to keep their politicians accountable for something that is in its nature an international issue? And how does the worsening impacts of climate change then lead citizens to change their behaviour and at the domestic, at the state, at the federal level? And how does that translate to the international forum? Because citizens can stand up, they can go, they can protest, but at best that leads to ambitious NDCs, which does not necessarily translate into ambitious policy. So I'm trying to just piece together what you guys think about the accountability mechanism here. Thank you.
Oh, happy to kick off. I'm glad you mentioned protest. I do think it's important. I think the experience of the Gilets jaunes in France and other kind of anti-climate change mitigation policy protests have spooked democratic governments, and they are in the minds of politicians in democratic countries, and it is maybe one of the main factors that hold parties back from offering more on climate change mitigation, when otherwise I've been arguing that most of the incentives have been to actually continue with carbon reduction. There are also some big logistical issues that we haven't been discussing so far, particularly going back to heat pumps that somebody mentioned. Just the logistical problem of kind of creating an industry to install all the heat pumps and all the insulation at the scale that's needed and speed that's needed is quite a challenge, and makes some governments nervous. And clearly the German government had some difficulty when people were really struggling to get the heat pumps in on schedule and by a deadline.
So I would jump onto what you're saying there, Stephen, which is protests against. Also, let's not forget, the world in 2019 had some pretty serious pro-climate protests. Greta Thunberg had a real moment, right? Getting Fridays for the Future into the UN, getting on stage, and it was really short-circuited by COVID. That was a climate moment that then redirected. And you could think about what a world would look like with different kinds of commitments if that protest movement had been able to take advantage of its policy window to a greater extent. So in many ways, on the question about impact, how do climate impacts affect people's behavior? That's something that that is an open area of research right now, because frankly, it's mixed. It's mixed. Some types of climate impacts people get used to, and they start to hit the snooze alarm, right? That it's not waking them up anymore. It's become normalized to have 60 days of plus 40 in Arizona, for example, which is wild, right? Let's just take, that's wild. But you adjust, you adapt. If you have enough money, you pay for it, and that works. I think that there are different types of impacts that can lead to stronger behavioral responses. And what I would point to here is attribution science. So attribution science is the idea that you take a given rainstorm like the one we had today, and you compare it against the historical record, and you run climate models of a world without warming. And you say, what would be the chances of a rainstorm like the one we had today if the world never had the warming that it has experienced? And with that, you can start to say that a given event with a certain amount of probability is more or less likely. To the extent that that can be developed, we'll never win the day. Ultimately, that's an argument that needs to be held with political language rather than probability, say. But it certainly would help.
Yeah, I wonder if climate change really is so different from other policy areas, because we know that citizens don't vote for specific outcomes. They vote for policies that are going in the direction of they think will bring the outcomes in the direction they want the outcomes to go. For example, the economy, a lot of the things that happen in the economy have nothing to do with what the government does. It has to do with global commodity prices and a whole lot of other things that are completely outside the control of the government. Nevertheless, the governments do make policy, and citizens respond to the policies they make, and they vote for a policy that X policy is going more in the direction that I want than policy of party Y. And the same with health. A lot of health outcomes depend on developments in medical science and what citizen behaviour and all kinds of things. I mean, the government has relatively little impact on health outcomes. But one party is proposing a policy that takes you slightly in this direction, or slightly in that direction. And so I think, with climate policy also, the people do vote to a large extent expressively. At least they express their preferences when they're voting, in addition to the other things they do. So that I'm not sure that it really is that much of a problem that the UK can't unilaterally solve the problem of climate change. People will still see as the UK should play its bit and play its bit in solving it. And so if you want the UK to play its bit, vote for the party that you think is going to achieve that the most. I don't see that as an insuperable accountability problem.
I mean, I just want to think about, the constraints that electoral systems in different countries impose on how you can bring climate politics to the fore. And if we're talking about America, we should turn our minds to issues that have been singular in motivating people to the ballot box over the last 50 years. Abortion comes to mind, gun rights comes to mind. And it's an open question how much climate is really coming to fill that sort of space. I don't see it yet, and part of it may be that the ways in which political expression around climate happens is in non-electoral arenas, in the form of protests or being out there visible, with how much it grows into people thinking, this is the one issue I care about, and I don't care about anything other than this one issue. and the willingness to engage with the two-party system in achieving that. So there are two things here. One is the green vote often goes to a third-party candidate, which is a complete waste of a vote, right? And the second is the use of non-voting means to make your point heard, which doesn't then come back to affect policy. So to the extent we need to think about climate, how much are we caring about climate as a singular issue for voting? What are the constraints in achieving that? Is it generational? Is it something to do with how much it's filtered into mass politics? I don't know, but I don't know how much mobilizing has gone into making that the most important issue, the number one issue that voters of a certain kind are motivated to do on election day, like we have seen happen in some other issue areas within American politics.
I believe we have another question over here.
Thank you for the very nice discussions. My question is very short. Professor Birch brought up the issue of ongoing heat wave and the electoral process in India. And what I know about the conduct of the elections, the Election Commission of India always comes up with this plan, and weather has always been a factor in how what arrangements it makes. In these elections, despite the heat wave in many parts, we've not really seen people complaining that the climate or the weather is adverse and they are being prevented from voting because of the adverse weather. So what do you really think is climate a factor in conduct of free and fair elections in India, or is it is just a fashionable statement that the ECI has made?
I mentioned that examples it's been in the news recently, but I'm not an Indian expert at all by any means. I think Pavi, who's just been there, is probably a better place to answer that question.
I don't think it's a fashionable issue at all. It's about, can you incentivize people to come and stand in a voting queue for hours to get to a vote when it's 45 degrees outside, right? It's a really practical problem, and one that will disproportionately affect people in rural areas. It'll disproportionately affect people who have poor infrastructure around them on voting day. And so I think this is one of the reasons the Election Commission for the past few election cycles has done voting over 7 phases, so that it can mobilize people to actually show up in hard to administer areas and be there on hand if things go sideways, right? And even this past phase where the elections hit Maharashtra and Bombay went to vote, people stood for hours in the heat to cast their vote, and a lot of them gave up. Right? They said, after a few hours, I'm not going to do this. And so it's a very practical matter how much heat matters to people's willingness to stay in line to finish voting. And if you think about it, then that's a political tool to be employed by somebody to pick an election day. If you think things are not going well for you, maybe you want a weaker turnout, you pick election day at the hottest times of the year. And so these things you have to impute backwards. And so I think if we want free and fair elections, what the ECI has at least attempted to do and take seriously climate mitigating measures is good. How much it's actually practically played out when the weather really works against you is, this is why I think empirically we can study these things. We will have polling station level data of turnout, and we can tell by degree differences whether that mattered to people's willingness to show up and vote on that day. And I think we should want to know these things.
I'll just add one additional thing, which is some political parties recognize that in a given area, the people who are voting, they would rather they stay home because they'll vote for the opposition party. And in the United States, you can see examples where it becomes illegal under local law to give people water who are standing in line to vote, or to give them a folding chair to let them sit. It is illegal. And it's not illegal for any other reason than they understand that heat is unpleasant and people will leave eventually. So I certainly agree, and it can be very much weaponized as well.
So we have time for one more question.
Yeah, I'm going to be really short. Hi, thank you. Thank you very much for the discussion. It was really interesting. I just wanted to have your perspective more on the global south, because I think, all the question about climate policy, I cannot really focus on the global north, if I can call it that way. For example, I'm a legal consultant in oil and gas, so I work in the fossil industry, and specifically for the West African countries, so Senegal, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire. And these countries, they have all something in common, that they have discovered huge, fossil energy that will change basically the country economy. And so being there, basically the question is not about, how are we going to sit on these resources that can change the country versus, now this is the climate change. So the future, just to go back to your point, Pavithra, is about how I'm going to make sure that I can finance this energy for the future of my country. So, that's why sometimes I'm pretty skeptic when I have, all this consensus about climate change. We all need to make an effort. But we, African country, we are the most impacted, and we are out of the discussion most of the time. And our perspective of climate change is like a moral obligation from the global north, who has been responsible because of the development, industrialization, etc. And nothing is done for the African country. And worse, basically, we forbid this country to develop this part. So what kind of alternative can we provide for them? So do you have any perspective on this subject, please? Thank you.
We can maybe start from the kind of political dynamic of this because, for example, Modi very much emphasizes these issues in terms of being historically less responsible, right? And having less responsibility.
And I think both parties would say this,
yeah.
Because I think neither side is going to dramatically do anything that's going to harm its chances of tapping into a natural source of fuel, as if they shouldn't. There was an amazing viral video a few months ago. I don't know how many of you caught it, and I may be misremembering, but Haitian representative speaking to an interviewer pushed back on exactly these grounds, which is, we're not responsible for historic greenhouse gas emissions. Why shouldn't we be allowed to experience some of the growth and development that comes with some of these natural resources? I think that's fair. But ultimately, if that contributes to the detriment of your own populations in terms of health outcomes, that's to be considered. So in the Indian case, for instance, it's been hard to stop crop burning. It's been really hard to get people out of bad coal mining. All of these have immediate lifetime outcome issues for Indians' health and development, right? So there is a story here, not just of, we weren't responsible historically, but there's a contemporary story of inequalities of who is engaged in these fossil fuel businesses and who within these countries are reaping the benefits of this. So again, the inclusive growth isn't just an international one, it's also within these countries, what do we do from making sure people actually reap the benefits of these natural resources in fair and equitable ways, and that they shouldn't always cleave on scheduled tribes in forests or scheduled castes who are working in the coal mines, or the kinds of marginalized groups that are bearing the brunt of these occupations while getting none of the benefits of that economic growth. And so politics needs to reflect those realities as well.
Yeah, so I would add a couple of things to what you're saying here, Pavi. So the question is sort of, how can you ask a developing country to sit on fossil fuel resources that they discover? And it's not just West African countries. We can look at Guyana, for example, as another country that discovered a couple $100 billion worth oil field offshore. And some of the international oil companies come around and they start contracting, and you start to see some pretty real corruption happening, right? Okay. That might be part of the price of getting those resources out of the ground, you might say. The real way that maybe the way to say this is it's true that a lot of these countries are not historically responsible, but if they plan to be economically vibrant in 10, 20, 30 years, locking yourself in by taking substantial and scarce state resources to develop fossil fuels, that's going to put money into a kind of economic production that the big players, the US's, the China's, the India's of the world, are saying they're going to get out of, right? So do you want to take the money that you have as a state and put it into a resource and bet that it will continue to be worth hundreds of billions of dollars by 2050? When in fact, being linked into a global economy, that's why those resources are valuable. And if the buyers aren't there for that product, you're going to be stuck with a lot of unhelpful infrastructure and wasted time. And you can take the example of, in Africa, skipping landlines, skipping wired electricity sometimes. Well, you need wired electricity, but you definitely don't need wired landlines. And a lot of people have just moved straight to cell phones. You could consider whether skipping the fossil fuel economy is something that would actually benefit these countries in the long term. And there are efforts to do that. Green Power Africa was an initiative under President Obama to try to spend quite a fair amount of money trying to get renewable energy into African countries so that way they can skip the fossil fuel economy. That might be a dead end. That's kind of the logic there.
I mean, I can see the logic there, but I think it's also fair to say you could, if you were an oil-rich country from the global south, sell your oil on the open market and then use the revenues to pay for solar panels, wind turbines, and do this kind of Norway type model. The other issue here, though, for several oil-rich countries in the global south is they are providing fossil fuel subsidies on huge scales for their own people, which actually, for the country as a whole, like Nigeria, is not actually the best economic strategy in the long run term for their people. So Neil McCulloch writes very well on this issue, and so. If you are going to sell the oil, better to sell it on the international market for a high price than to give it at a subsidized level to the people, but you do need to do something for your people. And sadly, in a lot of these countries, people don't see their governments doing much for them apart from subsidizing their oil prices or their fuel prices. And that's the challenge. Indonesia managed it for a while, but then it came unstuck. The challenge of removing fossil fuel subsidies is a huge, huge thing, but it can ultimately lead to great returns.
So as you can imagine, we could continue this conversation for the rest of the evening, but we're hitting our time constraint now, so apologies to everyone who couldn't answer a question or ask a question, and want to say thank you to the speakers. Thank you to you all attending.